Hello, and thank you very much for all of you being here in this rainy day. I am very honored to introduce Dr. Nima Naghibi to you, and I so much look forward to hearing
Thank you.
Nima. So Dr. Nima Naghibi, and my apologies for the voice, is interim chair and associate professor of English at Ryerson University. She teaches and researches in the areas of post-colonial and gender studies and is interested in questions of human rights in her teaching and her scholarship. Dr. Naghibi's research and publication to date have concentrated on representations of Muslim, Middle Eastern women in Western discourses. She is the author of Rethinking Global Sisterhood, Western Feminism and Iran, Minnesota Press, 2007, and her essays have appeared in English Studies in Canada, Interventions and International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, Radical History Review, and Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly. She is currently completing a monograph work that has been supported by a shared standard research grant on Diasporic Iranian women's life narratives, with a particular focus on theories of trauma, memory, and nostalgia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naghibi.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor John. Thank you so much, Victor John, for the lovely introduction. Thank you to Mama Tawakoli for inviting me here, and thank you, all of you, for coming out on this really spectacularly miserable day. I feel extra pressure. I hope that my paper is worth it.
Well, at least it's not raining in here.
At least it's not raining indoors, it's true. So before I launch into my discussion of diasporic Iranian prison narratives, what I'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes to situate my discussion about prison memoirs within the framework of the larger project that Victoria was talking about. So the manuscript I'm working on explores the popular trend among diasporic Iranian women to produce autobiographical stories in the shape of published memoirs, documentary films, and online narratives. Since the late 1990s, a growing number of Iranian women are deploying autobiographical forms to narrate their personal experiences of life in post-revolutionary Iran and in the diaspora. This is part of a trend that autobiography critics have been calling the memoir boom, or the age of memoir, which dates roughly from the early 1990s, with still no signs of abating. Diasporic Iranian memoirs, however, have not received the warmest of welcome among scholars who work on Iranian literature and culture. Some have critiqued what they have identified as an imperialist thrust to these memoirs. Others have gone further and traced connections between some memoirists and neoconservative institutions in the United States. In large part, though, the critiques against diasporic Iranian memoirs seem to come from a historical suspicion of the genre of memoir itself. As Thomas Kauser has observed, and this is a quote from him, until quite recently, memoir was minor and autobiography major. Memoir subliterary and autobiography literary. Memoir shallow and autobiography deep. Memoir marginal and autobiography canonical. Part of the prejudice against the genre of memoir versus the autobiography seems to be a sense that autobiography, with its long retrospective lens on a life, usually of a known personality, often male, connotes a thoughtfulness, an ability to think critically, that the memoir, with its focus on a shorter period of time or a singular event in a person's life, does not. The memoir tends to be understood as more emotional and therefore less reliable in its recording of events than an autobiography, which is seen as a more rational, balanced portrayal of a person's life. For me, Iranian memoirs are particularly interesting in their mediation of the diasporic experience through the author's memories of pre-revolutionary Iran, thus placing the concepts of memory and nostalgia and questions of testimony and witness at the heart of these narratives. As popular as diasporic Iranian memoirs written in English and published in the West are, they do not circulate, at least not widely and at least not to my knowledge, perhaps someone here could correct me, in Iran. What then are the cultural conditions that have led to such a receptive market for diasporic Iranian memoirs in the West? These memoirs are deeply emotional. They are deeply affecting in the stories that they tell. While some have been inclined to discredit them for being too emotional, my interest is precisely in their emotional and affective qualities. I'm curious about the kinds of affective responses these memoirs generate or invite. What is at stake, I wonder, in the circulation of such affects as nostalgia, empathy, and compassion? With specific attention to questions of memory, my research focuses on diasporic Iranian women's autobiographical expression and the contemporary compulsion to produce testimonial and personal narratives in response to two historical moments in Iran, the 1979 revolution and the 2009 post-presidential election protests. The 1979 revolution and the revolutionary energies of 2009 have produced possibilities of articulation and self-expression for diasporic Iranian women in particular, and these forms of autobiographical expression have emerged in various print and digitized media. Switching gears now to sort of focus more on the prison memoirs, I'd like to begin with a quotation from Elaine Scarry's essay, The Difficulty of Imagining Other People. And this is the quote. "The human capacity to injure other people has always been much greater than its ability to imagine other people. Or perhaps we should say, the human capacity to injure other people is very great, precisely because our capacity to imagine other people is very small." Elaine Scarry's powerful essay on the limits of human empathy and the seemingly limitless capacity for human cruelty provides a useful starting point to this talk as it gestures to some of the questions with which my talk today and my manuscript in general is concerned. How is suffering expressed in narrative, and what do narratives of suffering do? How can we, as privileged readers, bear witness to the traumatic experiences endured by political prisoners in a meaningful way, in a way that goes beyond merely expressing sympathy in the face of another's suffering? How can we, as readers located in the West, read and engage with narratives of violence, torture, imprisonment, and suffering, particularly when these narratives depict experiences in cultural and national locations with which the West has a compromised and often vexed relationship? Beginning with Marina Nemat's Prisoner of Tehran, 2007 saw the proliferation of diasporic Iranian women's prison narratives written in English. Other prison narratives published in 2007 include Camelia Entekhabi Fard's Camelia, Save Yourself by Telling the Truth, and the collection We Live to Tell, Political Prison Memoirs of Iranian Women. These were followed by Zara Qahramani's My Life as a Traitor, 2008, Haleh Esfandiari's My Prison, My Home, One Woman's Story of Captivity in Iran, 2009, Roxana Saberi's Between Two Worlds, My Life and Captivity in Iran, 2010, and most recently, Shahla Talibi's Ghosts of Revolution, Rekindled Memories of Imprisonment in Iran. These prison narratives are part of a wave of testimonial literatures that foreground suffering, drawing on a relatively recent, since the late, by which I mean late 18th century, genre of the humanitarian narrative. Diasporic Iranian women's prison narratives are part of a wave of testimonial literatures that foreground suffering, mobilizing what Gillian Whitlock calls a rights discourse that impels the reader to take up a compassionate stance. The emotive power of humanitarian narratives is particularly significant for generating ethical and moral responses to the suffering body. However, as Joseph Slaughter and Sophia McClellan argue, in this era, where the language of human rights is everywhere and thus nowhere, because it has become a tool wielded by both the left and the right to serve their own political agendas, cultural critics need to engage with the question of humanitarianism and of human rights while remaining vigilant against, and this is a quote from Slaughter and McClellan, the possibility of further emptying out the power and language of human rights in the process of making them commonplace. In his work on the similarities between the humanitarian narrative and that of the Bildungsroman, Slaughter has argued that the humanitarian narrative reasserts the modern individual with rights and with a voice, and explores what happens to this modern subject when faced with the denial of these rights. According to Slaughter, these types of narratives, and this is a quote, not only prompt emotional engagement, sympathy, and guilt, they can also promote a remarkable variety of types of action. In particular, individual victims' narratives seem to be a necessary component in the mobilization of empathy and in the formation of global political consequences to end the suffering of others. In considering this relatively recent proliferation of Iranian women's testimonial narratives, we need to also try and make sense of how certain narratives are received in the West. How do some narratives become more popular or more palatable or more relatable than others? How can we understand the far-reaching compassionate responses elicited by some well-known prison narratives, such as, for example, Prisoner of Tehran? How can we understand the expression of compassion in relation to Nemat's text against the marked lack of affective response to those unrepresentable subjects of trauma whose narrative reach does not extend as far, whose sufferings do not register as deeply upon readers in the West? What kinds of cultural and literary codes do these memoirs draw upon? Part of the answer lies in the generic conventions of the narrative itself. In Boom, Manufacturing Memoir for the American Public, Julie Rack argues for a turn to genre in helping us understand the appeal of memoirs, stating, and this is a quote, "Genre is a powerful organizing set of principles, preconceptions, and practices that, without calling attention to itself, drives much of the way memoir is produced, consumed, and received." Rack proposes a compelling theory for the generic appeal of the memoir, arguing that what makes a genre recognizable is the promise of repetition, but with a difference. In her words, and I quote her again, "If we think of genre as the non-identical repetition of familiar elements, it's possible to understand why, unlike literature with its features of uniqueness, generic writing is popular with many people. If literature generally works on the principle of difference, a great work of literature must be different from others, for example, then generic writing works because the recognition of repetition is pleasurable." The proliferation of humanitarian narratives through the genre of the diasporic Iranian prison memoir is critical for engendering Western sympathy for the suffering Iranian subject. Thus, the humanizing of subjects living under a vilified state relies on rendering the unfamiliar familiar. At times, that process is enabled and at times hindered through the deployment of recognizable narrative codes and genres, such as, for example, the captivity narrative or the romance novel. As scholars of captivity narratives have remarked, North America is where the captivity genre originated and flourished, beginning with, some argue, Mary Rowlandson's 1682 True History of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Thus, the captivity genre can be traced back to an early modern Western literary tradition that reflects Western anxieties about colonial exploration and exploitation. Captivity narratives usually involve a physical, usually sexualized threat of the male native other to the vulnerable American or British female body. This popular genre, with roots in 17th century New World contact narratives, experienced a resurgence in popularity with Betty Mahmoudi's Not Without My Daughter, as both Farzaneh Milani and Gillian Whitlock have observed. In Words Not Swords, Milani also refers to echoes of the genre of the captivity narrative in some recent memoirs about Iran. Milani takes a special care, however, to make a distinction between the hostage narrative and the prison narrative. Indeed, there are important differences between the two genres, but it would not be too far-fetched to suggest, as I do, that the appeal of prison memoirs such as Nemat's, for instance, has to do precisely with the fact that her narrative straddles the border between the two genres. In other words, precisely because Nemat's memoir affects at once the posture of a prison narrative while working within the generic conventions of the less taxing, in terms of readerly experience, captivity narrative, it has succeeded in drawing upon a broad audience. Thus, the popularity of prison memoirs, such as Nemat's Prisoner of Tehran, Qahramani's My Life as a Traitor, and to a lesser extent, Entakhabi Fard's Camellia, Save Yourself by Telling the Truth, can be in part attributed to the fact that they fulfill North American readers' expectations of what constitutes a female captivity narrative. In the tradition of the captivity genre, their stories are both racialized and eroticized. The truth of these authors' accounts of their brutalizing experiences in prison is decidedly not the issue here. Rather, Rack's claim about the recognizable, familiar, and pleasurable elements of genre provides a useful approach to considering the far-reaching humanitarian responses elicited by these memoirs. Thus, the recognizable genre of the captivity narrative plays on affective humanitarian responses to a familiar threat, the vulnerability of young women in the face of powerful, dominating men, often in a racialized context. This humanitarian response can be articulated in isolated terms, directed toward a suffering individual without taking into account the larger political and social forces that have led to unjust conditions. Here I'm interested in the distinction that Richard Ashby and Richard Brown make between human rights and humanitarian acts. While they have much in common and come from the same origins in liberal political philosophy of the 18th century, the relationship between the two is somewhat ambiguous and even fraught. So I quote them here. The historical divergence between humanitarianism and human rights is critical. The humanitarian seeks to assist fellow human beings and to alleviate suffering, and does not necessarily act to defend violated rights. In other words, the humanitarian response actually demands less from us. We can express feelings of sorrow or pity regarding an isolated case without turning a self-reflexive, critical eye towards the larger social and political system which creates inequalities and hierarchies, a system in which we may be ourselves complicit. Working within the generic tradition of colonial stories of captivity, Ne'mat's Prisoner of Tehran sets up a dichotomy between Ne'mat's own more civilized Christianity and the barbaric, in this case Muslim, worldview of her captors. Thus, the fictional tropes of the captivity narrative, which has Christian inflections, are familiar to Western readership and risk confirming rather than contesting generalized images of a threatening Iran. In her memoir, Ne'mat details the conditions of her arrest and imprisonment at age 16 in Iran's notorious Evin prison. Ne'mat is tortured and sentenced to death, but is dramatically rescued moments before her execution by her interrogator, who forces her to marry him. It's a sensational story in which her interrogator husband is soon murdered by his own colleagues in Evin, but thanks to the help of her in-laws, Ne'mat is released, eventually escapes to Canada, settling and raising a family in Aurora, teaching at U of T. So, in Prisoner of Tehran, Ne'mat repeatedly reminds us of her Christian faith. Of her first interrogation by her future husband, Ali, she writes, "Maybe I was the only Christian he had ever seen in Evin. He probably had expected me to be like most Muslim girls from traditional families, quiet, shy, and submissive. But I didn't have any of these qualities. In my life as a trader, Zara Qahramani, arrested at age 20 and held in Evin prison for participating in student protests, foregrounds her mother's Zoroastrian faith and positions herself as an exotic and pre-Islamic Persian princess. She invokes a romanticized image of ancient Persia and Zoroastrian values of peace and kindness, although she expresses a respect for the true values of Islam as practiced by her father." Camelia Entakhabi-Fard, a former journalist with the now-defunct daily newspaper Zan, has a Muslim background but takes pains early in the book to situate herself within a secular, westernized, and pro-Pahlavi family. Thus, Ne'mat, Qahramani, and Entakhabi-Fard are writing about Iran from minority positions. They foreground their minority religious status and their secular, westernized position. All three emphasize their Persianness as opposed to a Muslimness reviled in the West. Ne'mat's, Qahramani's, and Entakhabi-Fard's narratives are also highly eroticized, following the tropic conventions of both the captivity genre and the Harlequin romance, which hinge on the anxieties that emerge in response to the sexual threat posed by the figure of an often swarthy man. In Prisoner of Tehran, Ne'mat evokes her fragility throughout. Just before her interrogators lash her feet, the one declares, "Ali, look, she has such small wrists. They'll slide out of the cuffs," said Hamed. "He forced both my wrists into one cuff and dragged me to the bed." The crucial scene in which her execution is stayed is reminiscent of a Harlequin romance, a genre which often draws on the eroticized and racialized captivity narrative, in which the ingénue is abducted by a threatening, often dangerous man consumed with desire against whom she is powerless. All three texts, then, work within a framework of sexualized power relations between the male captor and the female captive. The figure of the brutish lover won over by a diminutive, meek young woman, conventional and popular romance, is a feature shared in both Camelia and Prisoner of Tehran, although Entakhabi-Fard presents herself in a more active role. as her interrogator's seducer, while Nemat remains an unwilling and passive victim. Nevertheless, the familiarity of this romance captivity narrative in Prisoner of Tehran is what may account for its wide appeal to a Western readership. Indeed, Nemat has become a minor celebrity in Canada. And its angry rejection by some former Iranian political prisoners, many of whom now live in Canada or Europe. The heated reactions to Nemat's book have been documented on Shahrzad Mojab's University of Toronto website, Memoirs and the Arts, Women Political Prisoners of Iran. This website lends, among other things, it lends itself as a forum to a group of people whose own traumatic experiences are clamoring to be heard. These former political prisoners have also written to Penguin Canada in protest, stressing the difference between fact and fiction, truth and falsehood. Quote, "If Ms. Nemat had presented this book as a novel or story, it would be another matter. But time and again in public interviews, she has insisted that the book is documentary and factual." The anger generated regarding the truth of Nemat's narrative is a criticism often launched against the writers of memoirs. However, as Thomas Kauser and other critics of memoirs and life narrative have remarked, the term memoir, quote, derives from the French word for memory. Calling a narrative about yourself a memoir usually signals that it is based primarily on memory, a notoriously unreliable and highly selective faculty. Thus, keeping in mind the origins of the term, I'm less interested in locating the truth and accuracy of a particular memoir than I am in exploring the tropic conventions employed by such narratives, the kinds of feelings these stories generate in readers, and in turn, what kinds of actions such feelings might inspire. Writing about the popularity and the marketing of life narratives, Schaeffer and Smith observe that, and this is a quote, "Publishing houses convert stories of suffering and survival into commodified experiences for general audiences with diverse desires, and also for an increasing number of niche audiences interested in particular kinds of suffering." All three prison narratives compel a humanitarian response from the reader as witness. These narratives engender some kind of feeling in the reader that can be a socially and politically transformative response to another's traumatic experience. However, while this engendered compassion may have transformative political or personal potential for the Western and Iranian reader of the prison memoir, we need also to bear in mind Ahmad's caution that stories, this is a quote from her, "Stories of pain involve complex relations of power. The overrepresentation of the pain of others is significant in that it fixes the other as the one who has pain and who can overcome that pain only when the Western subject feels moved enough to give." Similarly, Lauren Berlant has argued, and this is a quote, "Compassion is a term denoting privilege. The sufferer is over there." The gap that opens up between the object of compassion and the compassionate subject is where expressions of humanitarianism are articulated, underscoring how feelings of compassion and humanitarianism are inextricably bound up with complex relations of power. The prison memoirs of Entakhabi Fard, Qahramani, and Nemat illustrate the crossing vectors of compassion and humanitarianism. In the media literature on Nemat's book, there are frequent comparisons to Zahra Kazemi, the Iranian-Canadian photojournalist who was brutally raped and murdered in Evin. Nemat herself mentions Kazemi in a postscript to her book and claims to give her and other political prisoners voice through the writing of her memoir. This is a quote from Nemat. "If the world had paid attention earlier, if the world had cared, Zahra would not have died. Many innocent lives would have been saved, but the world remained silent, partly because witnesses like me had been afraid to speak up. But enough was enough. I was not going to let fear hold me captive any longer. I had a story to tell. Zahra had given Iran's political prisoners a name and a face. Now it was my turn to give them words." By claiming the position of one who speaks the truth at her own risk, Nemat authenticates her narrative through association with Kazemi, whose violent death in Evin has come to symbolize the brutality of the Islamic regime. Nemat's invocation of Kazemi thus validates the truth of her own experiences, thereby establishing her as worthy of her readers' compassion. Nemat's second memoir, After Tehran, A Life Reclaimed, is about the writing of her first memoir, the emotional turmoil she endured as a result of its publication, and the backlash she experienced in the Iranian community. Here she constructs herself as a victim once again, not only of the memories of prison haunting her, but also of the unfavorable reaction to her prison memoir by her family and Iranian audiences alike. This follow-up memoir is dedicated to Neda, the young woman who was shot and killed on the streets of Tehran in the summer of 2009 and became the iconic face of the Green Movement. Nemat as a Christian, Qahramani as a secular Persian Zoroastrian, and Intikhabi Fard as secular and westernized are seen as tolerant or tolerable subjects who fit in the West by virtue of their minority status in Iran and because of their recognizable and familiar subjectivities for the Western reader. Their stories of imprisonment and struggle for freedom inspire the compassion of like-minded liberal subjects. But these testimonial narratives of suffering and pain, which impel us to bear witness and to feel the suffering of those represented in these texts, and also presumably the suffering of those who cannot represent themselves, Kazemi would be one such example, remind us that, and this is a quote from Elizabeth Spellman, claims of shared human suffering can do as much to reinforce claims of superiority and inferiority as they can to undermine them. How then do we engage with testimonial literatures with stories of suffering without reproducing inequities between compassionate readers and differently constituted subjects of suffering? Talebi's Ghosts of Revolution is a prison memoir that operates in a different register than any of the ones previously discussed. Unlike the prison memoirs considered above, Talebi offers a historical contextualization of Iranian society and politics that does not lend itself to hastily drawn conclusions about the country as a unilaterally brutal place. Rather than working within the limits of the genres of the captivity narrative or the romance novel, Ghosts of Revolution can be described in terms of what John Beverly has termed the testimonio, which translates as testimony, the act of bearing witness to injustice. Talebi writes in graceful prose, intertwining her memories of suffering and torture in prison with those of her fellow inmates, and of their collective efforts to keep themselves intact under the dehumanizing effects of torture. Talebi's memoir, an emotionally challenging read, is a story of defiance against oppression and of binding love between those who have suffered the unimaginable torments of political prisons. This is a powerful text that bears witness to the traumatic effects of torture and imprisonment in pre- and post-revolutionary Iran, and to the horror of the mass executions of 1988, during which thousands of political prisoners, including her own husband, were summarily killed and thrown into unmarked graves. Now a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies at Arizona State University, Talebi's memoir engages with questions of torture and suffering through a deeply personal and complex theoretical lens. According to Scary, physical pain is language destroying. That's a quote from her. Joseph Slaughter has argued that, and this is a quote from him, as a human rights violation, torture is paradigmatic in its implementation as a tool to destroy a speaking subject. However, one could argue that the proliferation of diasporic Iranian women's prison narratives in recent years contests Scary's and Slaughter's claim about the destruction of the voice of the tortured subject. Indeed, Talebi's narrative works in deliberate and thoughtful ways as a challenge to Scary's formulation of torture as language destroying. Her memoir is a poignant and deeply affecting testimonial to both the cruelties and the generosities of human relationships. In response to the attempted destruction of her voice, Talebi offers a moving account of her experience in prison and as a victim of torture. Describing her reaction to the fate of some of her former cellmates who shortly after their release succumbed to the traumatic memories of torture and imprisonment by committing suicide or descending into madness, Talebi writes, "I realized that I was not writing or dreaming about my experience, or more accurately, did not know what I was dreaming about, nor was I aware if I was even dreaming at all. It was a state of despair, a space of silence and lost voice. I was no longer even singing to myself as I used to. Horrified by this realization, I reluctantly began to write, and my writings were saturated with the ghosts of the dead and the spirits of the mad." Putting pen to paper, she expresses her voice and shares her memories alongside descriptions of her friends and cellmates, articulating a vision of humanity that conceives of human relationships as interdependent, stressing her belief that the well-being of oneself is necessarily dependent upon the well-being of others. Every chapter in Ghosts of Revolution incorporates stories of other people whose lives became inextricably intertwined with Talebi's own in prison, and whose sufferings impressed themselves upon her memory. With sensitivity and empathy, Talebi traces and narrates the trajectory of each individual's life. In extreme cases, as in the irrevocably damaged young Roya, who has removed herself cognitively and emotionally from her immediate surroundings, Talebi and her fellow prisoners hypothesize about her life before prison. Speculating about her middle-class background, Talebi fleshes out Roya's pre-prison life, thus offering her in the fullness of generosity, and even without Roya's awareness, memories of happiness, love, and security, a time before prison, a time before torture. Throughout her memoir, Talebi offers moving descriptions of her inmates, even humanizing a particularly despised recanter, or tawab, as they called them, Fawzi, by contextualizing her story through a sympathetic framework that challenges Scary's claim with which this talk began. And I'll repeat, our capacity to imagine other people is very small, is what Scary said. Talebi intertwines these descriptions of others' lives with memories of her own past, of her family, and of her husband, who was executed in 1988. In Ghosts of Revolution, Talebi puts forward a vision of the individual as always already contingent on another. Conjuring Scary's perception of torture as the total destruction of the boundaries of the liberal individual subject, she draws attention to the fact that human lives are always relational. And this is a quote from Talebi. Free agency is an elusive modern liberal concept, true, but rethinking it in a context of the other and within a collective notion of human existence, concerned with an ethics of living responsibly and responsively in relation to others, is the ideal that, no matter how utopian it may be, is worth pursuing. In a moving illustration of how the dissolution of the boundaries of the individual under torture can challenge the modern construction of the self-contained individual, Talebi relates the story of Sudi and Behruz, who were subjected to torture in the same chamber. As related by Sudi, even in the extremities of pain, Behruz was full of love and empathy for her suffering and gave her the tools with which to survive, even as he knew his own death under torture was inevitable. Quote, but what was certain was the fact that for Sudi, Behruz's resistance had generated a sense of hope and showed her a power beyond the destruction of torture that not only allowed her to survive the torture, but taught her the art of living and dying. Refusing to bargain with his dignity and humanity, he confronted the system of individualization according to which all a person cares about is his own pain and happiness. Behruz's attitude indicated how his ethics of care for the self was linked to his care for others. Again, this collective sensibility offers redemptive possibility, yet being at odds with the triumphant individualism favored in the genre, it does not necessarily have the same reach as other more popular prison memoirs. Thus, Talebi's memoir as humanitarian narrative in the form of testimonial makes claims on the reader to respond to narratives of suffering in ethically and politically responsible ways, but it also places stress on the modern conception of the individual as self-contained and autonomous. As Talebi relates her visceral account of pain and torture, she writes also of resilience and of the possibility of retaining one's humanity, one's ability to feel empathy, even in the most brutal of conditions. As she recounts her experiences and those of others, however, she is sensitive to the challenges of the genre in which she is writing, emphasizing the unreliability of the faculty of memory. Relying on memory to access a pure and authentic account of the past is obviously an impossibility. Talebi is sensitive to the multiplicity of ways in which she can narrate her story of imprisonment, depending on how she remembers events at any given time. Recognizing the centrality of memory in autobiographical writings underscores the importance of allowing ourselves to be, quote, touched by the past, as Roger Simon describes it. For Simon, to be touched by the past is not simply to feel empathy or pain in the face of another's traumatic recall. In his words, at stake in the touch of the past is the welcome given to the memories of others as a teaching, not simply in the didactic sense of imparting of new information, but more fundamentally as that which brings me more than I can contain. To be brought more than one can contain is not a condition in which one becomes a symptom of a history one cannot possess, but rather a condition of possibility for true learning, one which bears the risk of being dispossessed of one's certainties. Ghosts of Revolution stands apart from the memoirs discussed above. This is not a sensational story in the style of the captivity narrative, nor is it a stark description of events in the style of a political manifesto. Rather, Talibi's memoir is about the resilience of ordinary people in dehumanizing and degrading conditions. It is also, uncomfortably, the story of the evils committed by ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, such as her recounting of the torture and suffering inflicted on the village dog by a group of boys when she was a child, or of the pleasure with which her teachers inflicted corporeal punishment on nonconformist students. Talibi interweaves her memory of the torture to which she and others were subjected in prison with her childhood memories of the physical and emotional suffering inflicted by other children on their peers. A particularly disturbing episode for her family involved a group of young men who tormented and terrorized her good-natured but slow-witted cousin, Youssef, by tossing him into a fast-moving river in the full knowledge that he did not know how to swim. Quote, gulping the water, frozen and paralyzed, he stared at death spreading over him. His last look at the world he knew till then was at the devilish expressions in his friends' eyes and their grinning faces enjoying themselves at his expense. This time of eternity for Youssef was also the moment of exceeding pleasure for his co-workers, an instant during which Youssef crossed the line to the world of the absolute other. Drawing comparisons between this instance of group violence and the mass prison killings in 1988, she writes, the way that everyone seemed to have played a part in drawing Youssef to his final destination reminds me of the massacre of political prisoners in the summer of 1988. The prison officials pursued a policy of having everyone's hands in the system covered with prisoners' blood. It was to keep everyone silent about the massacre, for if they spoke, the secret of their own role in the crime would be revealed. Talibi's memoir thus extends a significant challenge to readers. It requires us to self-reflect in ways that can be deeply uncomfortable, asking us to imagine not only others suffering when they are at a safer move, but also to reflect on the disturbing affinities between the cruelties to which human beings subject each other in their quotidian lives, with the torture and betrayal of friends and cellmates in a heightened, harrowing context such as in prison. Talibi's memoir, then, compels us to contemplate and acknowledge in profoundly unsettling ways the limits of our own humanity. Contrary to Scary's statement regarding the impossibility of imagining and feeling empathy for others, and despite his own reservations about feeling moved without feeling moved to action, Thomas Laqueur also recognizes that, quote, narratives of suffering generate fellow feelings that are, and historically were, crucial to the origins and continuing success of an ever-widening struggle for human rights. Thinking about memoir as a genre that generates feelings of empathy for the sufferings of another, and as a mode of expression that humanizes an other, affords us an understanding of the prison memoir both as a testimonial that bears witness against injustice, and as a humanitarian narrative that demands of us to rethink our conceptions of ourselves as self-contained individuals. Keeping in mind the limitations of the humanitarian impulse with which this talk began, an absolute rejection of humanitarianism would be not only a tragic error, but also a posture struck out of the myopia of total privilege. For those who have suffered